Hello, Happy New Year to all of you, and Happy New Year to you, Dean.
And to you, Bernard.
We decided to change our format a little bit for this first DBTT of 2026. And basically, we're going to discuss what we think are key trends or things that are likely to change or be heavily on the agenda, let's put it that way, in 2026. We've got five different categories: connectivity, data centers, AI, regulation, and then geopolitics. And maybe we can get started on the connectivity one. What do you have on your list of stuff that may happen?
Right. Well, things that are happening is, firstly, this year is going to be quite a lot of heavy lifting on defining what 6G mobile is going to be. The standards work is ongoing, and I'm expecting that to continue at 3GPP, but also more generally, especially with angles on. We'll talk about spectrum later, but things like what does AI native mean for 6G? And I'm doing quite a lot of work trying to work out where we're going to see automation, whether there's going to be the connectivity really fundamentally enabled by AI, or whether AI is a sort of on the side to improve performance and reliability, and essentially allow for automation and lower OPEX. I know you've got some thoughts on things like copper switch off for fiber, especially in for driving fiber uptake, especially in Europe, and the other one we'll come back to is satellite. But what are you seeing either on the mobile side or on the fiber side?
Well, on the mobile side, I think there is a kind of conundrum around the cost of deploying whatever 6G is when we finally know what it is. And we've been hearing a lot of pushback from service providers saying there's no way we're investing as much on 6G as we did on 5G. And one of the paths to making that investment less burdensome is some forms of infrastructure or spectrum sharing or both. And I'm there's a paradox there because, well, telcos, especially ex-incumbents, are notoriously unhappy about sharing anything, but at the same time, it might make investment cases a lot more palatable. So I'm a bit curious as to whether that's going to become a topic that comes to the front a little bit in
It,
2026.
I mean, in an ideal world, it would have done. I mean, I've been talking about ideally 6G being, if you like, spectrum sharing native for quite some time. But to be honest, if I look at what is coming out of whether it's GSMA, where they had their Vision 2040 on spectrum recently, which I looked at on my Substack, some things that are coming out of the US in terms of the US presidential memorandum on it was like titled "Winning the 6G Race," but it was mostly about spectrum. And I expect we may well see something in the DNA in Europe, and certainly in 3GPP. There's not much in about the dynamic sharing models and next gen spectrum management. Maybe it'll creep in other ways, but at the moment it seems to be a bit of a last gasp land grab for as much licensed spectrum as possible, and particularly before the World Radio Congress in 2027. I think that they're going to try and keep the message simple of clear as much as you can and give exclusive licenses. And I think there's the rest of us around the side
Mm.
saying that's not the most efficient way, but from a conservative point of view, and also from the vendor's point of view, it's the most attractive way of just sort of selling more radios.
Well, unless it pushes everything back by a few more years. So, okay, that's interesting. I certainly think we're going to discuss that again this year.
Definitely.
So you asked about copper switch off. I mean, paradoxically, I don't think there's much to expect from 2026 on copper switch off, especially because despite all the regulation you might put in place to ease it or accelerate it or facilitate it, if you don't have an alternative connectivity solution that's available to most of the subscribers in a given area or even nationally, then you can't switch off the copper. And I think certainly in Europe, And I think in a lot of other geographies, most of the countries that we can have a look at are in that position. So Spain has switched off its copper because it had quasi-universal fiber coverage, with the last few percentages handled with primarily fixed wireless access and probably some satellite. France is on its way, and we'll see in a few years how these last few percentage points get handled. I don't see anyone else in Europe that's actually progressing this much. So even though, like, the Commission has said they wanted to really, put tools in place that are going to accelerate this, I don't see how they do that. So I don't know. It's weird because I think it's going to be a big topic in 2026, but I don't think we're going to see much change.
I mean, my understanding was that was one of the grounds for quite a lot of pushback on the draft of the DNA, and well, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But I think that some markets, probably Germany at the top of that list, that are not going to necessarily want to have a really accelerated timeline for copper switch off.
For sure. For sure.
And then, well, satellite. And yeah, I historically, well, like most people, until about 3 years ago, I'd never really spent as much time on satellite as I did on other forms of wireless, of cellular and Wi-Fi and things. But now satellite is pretty much the top of everyone's agenda. My expectation for this year is, well, the first is we're going to continue seeing this emphasis on direct to device from satellite. I think it's going to be very interesting, and it's going to be very hyped, especially if there's a SpaceX IPO in the middle of it, or some other fundraising. But I think that fundamentally it's got hard limitations. I also think we're going to see a lot of other interesting things going on with satellite, continued adoption of fixed wireless via satellite, and some sort of other things around things like Earth observation, and generally the cost of getting stuff to orbit is going down. We might see Amazon and others become more competitive with their launch systems, and there's certainly again a ton of geopolitics here, and spectrum issues as well. What are you
I
seeing?
yeah, no, I think that's right. I am still somewhat skeptical with how broad the opportunity is for satellite in the connectivity space, and particularly if things get competitive with Amazon now, full going ahead, having launched its first few arrays already, opening service in Europe in the next few weeks. It is, I don't know. I'm curious to see if two major American players plus a hypothetical European initiative a few years down the line have space to coexist and actually make money on what I still think is a, you know, not insignificant but not massive subsection of the market.
Yeah, I saw a presentation from Amazon Leo that, in fact, the day they changed the name of it, and that for me makes some sense for sort of B2B use cases, because it's clearly going to plumb directly into the whole sort of AWS dashboard and marketplaces. And so, if you're an enterprise and you want to connect a remote site, or you want to back up, or you want to have workloads which are located on edge data centers that are next to the satellite ground station, all that stuff I think makes a lot of sense. But we'll see whether that has an impact on the wider consumer market as well.
I agree, but even there, it's going to be edge cases that get kind of targeted. So you're not. I mean, no company in their right minds is going to use that as their primary connectivity means for their headquarters, right? So
No.
yes, if they have a remote site or two or five, they might use these types of solutions. Because it's going to be cheaper than pulling a fiber there, and it's going to be better than relying on copper for sure. But having said that, how big is that market? And it's really an open question mark to me.
It's going to be, I think, it's certain industries. So, most obviously shipping and transportation and logistics is the most obvious one. But then there's things like oil and gas and mining and resources. Yeah, for things like, day-to-day healthcare and stuff. No, because we know what a hospital is. It's going to have a fibre, but I will see. Anyway, we
So
should probably move on a
just
little
on
bit.
to end on that, on the shipping and logistics, I think it's an IoT issue more than anything. Like if your device costs $100, there's no economies of scale in making that happen. So that's the real question mark. Okay, yeah, good point. All right, so data centers.
Yes. I suppose to have a link, first off, and I'm not going to go through all the multiple reasons, there's a new hype around space-based data centers, and I'm not going to address the long laundry list of why I think that's overhyped, but it's cooling and latency and everything else. But the main market for data center infrastructure, I think this year I don't buy this idea of a complete bubble. I think there's maybe a bubble in valuations, but it's pretty clear that Nvidia is selling all the GPUs it can make, and TSMC. I think the bottleneck is increasingly around the energy supply and distribution. So, it's things like its transformers or grid capacity, which are in many ways slowing things down. So I think there's going to be a couple of things here. One is we will see continued data center build out, and not just in the top tier markets, but in essentially anywhere which has access to power, to cooling, and to favorable site planning. And there's some geopolitics here as well, with things like subsea cable routes, which play into this. I
And
think.
land routes.
And land routes as well. I mean, you're seeing
Yeah.
that people trying to avoid the Red Sea, for example, and go overland to Asia through
No, but
Europe.
I also meant in-country land routes. So,
Yeah,
where you locate your data centers is going to be very much determined by, once you've solved the energy bit, how much connectivity you can get.
I mean, to some extent, I think the energy is the gating factor. I mean, I know I saw presentations from, I think it was Lumen in the US, who were saying that they're having to build out fiber into the middle of Montana or wherever it is, because that's where the data centers are getting built. And I suspect you can probably lay a fiber for 500 miles faster than you can put in a high voltage
For
electrical
sure.
set of pylons and stuff. So I think I
For
agree,
sure.
but I think that's a secondary issue in some of this. What I think we'll see is, well, firstly, if I'm looking at the vendor landscape, obviously the semiconductor side of it is growing hugely. I think there is this much talked about shift from training to inference, but I think that's a little bit overstated. There's now, if you look at AI architecture, it's moving towards what's called either continuous or online training, and so I think this sort of binary distinction between training and inference is going to get fuzzier over time. I also
But
think we're going to see a
on that,
shift. Yeah.
sorry, on that point though, don't you think that, I mean, there we are in the middle of a very heavy training cycle.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that that's going to stop entirely, but I guess the shift is going to become less emphasized on that and more emphasized on usage down the line. My concern is not so much, I guess my concern is, as always, like governments in Europe are falling over each other to try and facilitate data center installation,
Factories.
etc. And by the time they start funding this stuff, they certainly won't be funding. But I don't know if what they will be funding is as sustainable as they think it is. I guess is my question mark.
I've been trying to sort of dig into the guts of how AI architecture is changing, and I must admit I'm not an expert on this, but there seems to be continual or retraining or updating. Maybe some of the foundation models will be reduced in terms of sort of what new features we have in ChatGPT 6, 7, whatever. But I think that where we are seeing is a move from just the text tokens to things like voice tokens, so things like voice AI. You're going to see people doing movement as a native AI input for things like robotics or drones, where you actually sort of map the patterns of things moving around. You already see that in speech. So it may be that we shift from the consuming all the text on the internet to video to movement to sensor input and stuff like that.
So
One
we'll
thing
be
I think
training other things, but we'll still need training
y-
capability.
I think so. Yeah, and I think that
Okay.
the line between training and inference will blur. I think some of the inference, for example, right down on the end device, yeah, if you've got a model on your phone which does image recognition and you search your photo library for pictures of a cat or a
Hmm.
bottle of wine you recognize or something like that, I think that can be static. But I think that some of the other domains for AI will need constant retraining. So a lot of the stuff I'm looking at around AI in networks is you have to think about there's both drift in the model, but there's also drift in the physical environment you will need to retrain because of new construction in the radio environment. And so what you thought you knew about radio propagation in a cell is different in a month's time because there's a new building or
Yeah.
construction or road diversion or something. So I
Yeah.
think that there will still be training, but I think it might look a bit different. And I think that then pulls through to on the vendor side. Obviously, semiconductors. I think we'll see some new classes of lower power semiconductor. You saw the acquisition by Nvidia of a company called Grok with a Q rather than a K, so it's not the same as Elon Musk Grok recently. And I think we'll see headlines about really low power AI using potentially things like neuromorphic and other new radical chip designs. I think that's still mostly R&D, but it's stuff I think people will start talking about low energy AI and what does that do for infrastructure. One thing I will also say is on the optical side, that's not slowing down. There's a lot of interest in the optical and photonics side of this, and I'm seeing more discussion of things like co-packaged optics, where you essentially don't have a separate transceiver for the optical chip in the connecting the processor to the network. And that's lower energy consumption and smaller form factor. So I think that optical network domain, you see companies like Nokia. I think, to be honest, as we talked about in our last podcast, I think that's a big part of the Nokia Nvidia deal is the
Yeah.
optical connectivity.
Yeah. Okay, so that segues nicely onto AI as a topic in and of itself. I have the some skeptical views, which, as you know, but you're more gung ho on this. So let's start with how do you think this is getting adopted and actually changing stuff, not from the provider side, but from the user side.
User side, and I hear, I keep seeing people citing an MIT study of 95% of Gen AI trials in enterprises didn't work. I'm like, well, to be honest, it's very early stage and it was a very small sample, and the trials are so cheap and easy to run that actually, if you can have a 1 to 20 success rate, that's actually not bad if you look at it through the lens of a sort of VC background. I think clearly we're seeing AI having more impact in enterprises in things like software development and certain areas where you can run agents. So things like contact centers, I think, are very high on the list. Is it going to essentially change the way you produce steel or things like that? Probably not, but I think it'll crop up in maybe pharmaceutical, some of the R&D side, and that won't come through in ROI because it's still got to go through all of the rigorous testing and multiple phase projects. So it might be the top of the funnel, but the funnel is still 5 years or 10 years. And so I think it's sometimes very easy to, people say, oh, we're running all this stuff and it's not appearing in the bottom line yet. Well, apart from employment, it's very hard to sort of generate new additional revenue or improve margin overnight. Doesn't matter what the
Absolutely.
technology is, whether it's AI
The,
or private networks or all the stuff we've talked about.
I think that's correct. I would add that a lot of these trials, I suspect, are nonsensical. Like, in order to have results, like the first thing you need to do is, for example, not automate something that's not working already, which in many businesses is probably what is happening. Rather than say, okay, the process is wrong, before we try to AI, kind of agentize whatever the verb is, that process. Let's actually, assess whether that process is working. So I think there's probably a lot of unintelligent users of AI, which is ironic, I guess. But I would certainly agree with that. I'd add to this point that I saw a very interesting interview that was run by Marcus Weldon, the ex head of Nokia's R&D and Bell Labs. is doing a series of interviews on AI and the impacts of AI, which I saw a few of them and they're really interesting. But one of them was talking to an economist about jobs, and the interesting thing is that they are absolutely seeing effects on employment already. So it's not a it's not it's not a scare. It's actually happening, but it's happening in very different ways on very different jobs. And what's interesting to me is that the jobs that seem to be impacted primarily are kind of middle class jobs.
Yeah.
They're not physical jobs for the most part, and they're jobs that previous industrial shifts have not really impacted negatively, and in fact, rather impacted positively. So I'm actually curious to see when, because I think it's inevitable, when that turns into a political pushback and how. Because, unfortunately, when the lower class is impacted, there's usually a big consensus to say, yeah, it'll sort itself out, no worries. But it's when it's your core electorate, the people who actually go out to vote, that are impacted. I think one of the things we might start to see in 2026 is actually this coming into the political discourse in a much more forceful way, not necessarily effectively, but I do think we're going to see that happen.
We're going to see protest marches of accountants and people who used to work for McKinsey and Deloitte. Yeah,
That's
maybe.
maybe a bit early for that, but I think we're going to see some politicians and some parties actually take that on as a problem that needs to be regulated at the very least or sorted.
I think there's that where I think that's also going to get accelerated potentially. I don't know if it's this year or another year or two, is around what's being called physical AI, which is also an opportunity for the telecoms industry, which is connectivity for robots. I mean, I was very skeptical initially of the idea that a humanoid robot was what we needed, but actually, given that most business processes, physical ones, are designed around, a human of, whatever rough normal human dimensions are, having the ability to load a truck or to push a trolley around a hospital or deliver food or something like that. I think that's perhaps also where there's going to be some impact from an employment point of view. And I see some implausible forecasts from sort of Musk with, I've forgotten the name of Tesla's robot. Is it Optimus or something like that? And there's about 20 other different. I'm sure as we're recording, CES is on in Las Vegas, and I expect to see the sort of robotics videos coming out fast and furiously over the next few days. So I think that's an area. One that I'm looking at is around. I've already mentioned the contact centers is voice and AI. And some of that's going to be useful, and that's not going to be replacing humans. It's going to have a voice agent that screens your calls for you and looks for deep fakes and scams. But certainly, you wouldn't want to be a contact center operator over the next 3 to 5 years, when it's going to be possible to have real-time speech in multiple languages with all your sentiment analysis and access to all of your customer data and CRM systems. Are we going to have human contact center agents? Well, a very small number, I think.
Well, the other thing is no one wants to talk to contact
It,
centers when they're pushing it anymore, and the companies don't want you to talk to people anyway. So yeah,
yeah,
we'll see.
yeah.
One last thing on this. Next week, I'm in Brussels for an open internet event that RCEP is organizing to celebrate the 10 years of the open internet regulation. And at that event, they're going to present a study that they published in December on AI and energy. I have deliberately not read it because I'd like to hear how they talk about it before I actually read the documents. But that's maybe something we'll discuss next time.
Definitely, and also next week I'm running in London my next Unthinkable Lab event, which is looking at telecom APIs and whether AI AI agents end up being what consumes telecom APIs rather than human engineers and
Mm.
developers. And there's a particular technology called MCP that might help there, but I'll report on that next time we speak.
Okay. Cool. All right. So let's move on to the last section, which is regulation and geopolitics. So obviously, everyone has on their agenda right now January 20th, which is when the European Commission will supposedly publish the DNA.
The long-awaited DNA, yeah.
Yeah, long-awaited DNA. Yeah, absolutely. The weird thing is that, as important as this is going to be in all the discussions in 2026, I don't think whatever is in there is going to have an impact for quite a while still, because the parliamentary process and the whole political process within the European institutions takes a long time. So unless, well, in fact, even if there is not much that changes in there, some parliamentaries are going to try to push for more radical changes. Others are going to try to fight back. So it's really hard to think that this is going to have an impact before, at the very least, 2027 and possibly later. Now, you had a point about this also, which I think is interesting and might be a bit more short term, about how this overlaps with other areas of regulation.
I think one of the things I've noted is divergence or even orthogonality between different regulatory focus areas, particularly in Brussels. And so I'm going to be looking to see what's in the DNA and does it roughly align, or does it work against what other things are being said by the Commission on data, on AI, on chips, on cloud, on privacy, on energy as well. Come to that, because all of those, in theory, all ought to sort of tie together. But what I've noticed in the past is that they tend to sort of, when you get to the detail, you suddenly realise that on one hand, Europe's talking about a sovereign cloud industry, and on the other hand, it's trying to think about regulating IP interconnect or something when you actually need more interconnect and a dense mesh of it. And there's a few other sort of examples of inherent contradiction, and hopefully the DNA has addressed that and ends up being more in alignment with the other goals rather than and trying to take off part of the industry in the wrong direction.
Well, I guess from our next installment onwards, that's one of the things we're going to have to look into for sure.
Yeah, I mean, so
One
other
thing I
things.
wanted to, yeah, sorry,
Yeah,
go on.
I was going to say also, in terms of a regulation point of view, other stuff I'm looking at for this year is in the UK. There's Ofcom doing the telecom access review, looking at things like wholesale for fixed networks and where OpenReach sits in that. There's going to be a bunch of stuff on the spectrum side around preparations for World Radio Congress 27, which comes at the end of 27, but it's like a 4 year cycle. And this year there's a lot of the hard work, and there's a continual stream of stuff coming out in the US, whether it's on wireless, on spectrum, on funding for connectivity in rural areas, and satellite and everything else. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of things come out of FCC and NTIA to look at over the next 12 months.
Yeah, one thing that I'm wondering about is, like, in the last few years, but it's picked up again in the last few weeks. We've heard discussions in the US about repealing Section 230, which protects social networks and platforms from being litigated on stuff that is posted on said platforms. And it's been an underpinning of allowing the internet in general and platforms in particular to share content without that risk of litigation. We have similar regulation in Europe. I don't actually know what it's called, but I know that there's similar things in Europe. What I think is interesting here is that with all this talk about free speech, which is going to seed into our next segment, but there is a fundamental question about accountability of the algorithmic nature of the platforms. In other words, it's not because something is posted that they might be responsible, but it's because something is pushed. And also, the other aspect, and this has been highlighted by the frankly scandalous strip of photo feature that emerged on X a couple of weeks back, is the Section 230 specifically is designed to protect the platforms from stuff that is posted by people. And there is a very real argument that this is not stuff posted by people. And
Mm.
so I am wondering if we might come to some reconsideration of some of the key underpinnings that currently protect a lot of the tech industry from any forms of liability on the content that gets carried over their networks.
I think you might be right, and especially the distinction between platform and model from an AI point of view is going to become very, very blurred, and it already is with X and Grok, for example, or
Yeah,
for that matter, Meta and a bunch of others. I mean, ChatGPT and OpenAI and Perplexity are going the other direction. I noticed even my browser's got I'm using Firefox, got a Perplexity icon on it if I want to use it, and obviously you've got co-pilots everywhere and Google Gemini. So maybe there's going to have to be some thought about what you do when you say, well, I didn't post it, my AI did, or your AI as a platform tuned it and tweaked it. And so I think there certainly will need to be, here it's going to depend on the way you are in the world, either case law or some much better definitions, because I'm not sure, I don't know the wording of Section 230, but clearly it was done in an earlier era,
yeah,
and we're now in a very, very different landscape.
that's absolutely true. So if we move on to the broader
Hmm.
sovereignty discussion, right? Free speech is becoming a political
Yeah.
dispute point
Yeah.
between the US and Europe for sure, but obviously China has a different view on free speech as well.
Well,
so
yes. Yeah.
so how do you how do you see that impacting stuff in 2026?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one is the US is really pushing hard against digital services rules and taxes in Europe, whether that's EU, UK, or elsewhere. And so the sort of DSA and to a lesser extent the DMA. That's the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. I sometimes get them conflated, and there's various things around privacy as well. And so, you do have the sort of US trying to use the sort of free speech absolutist position against some of the fundamental underpinnings of particularly EU regulation on tech and telecoms. Um, I'm not sure what that's going to look like. I mean, there's a bleed across here into the wider discussions around sovereignty, and when you get into sovereignty, I think we talked about on the last day. There's sort of data sovereignty, there's policy sovereignty, there's actual tech stack and supply chain, lots of different angles here, and so clearly, there's going to be a pushback on. Historically, frankly, Europe has always been quite proud of exporting its regulation, whether it's GDPR or anything
Yeah.
else. And I think it may end up in a world where it's got some imports as well.
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's two ways this can play out, right? And I'm going to put the threat of military intervention to the side for a second, even though I'm not sure we can do that anymore. But there's a point at which what you lose if you go full ahead on what they don't want, the US, becomes the only viable option. In other words, once the threat has been implemented anyway, which the Trump administration has done with tariffs and is doing now with threatening various politicians, etc., and the way it would with a dictatorship that they didn't like. There's a point where actually doing what they don't want you to do doesn't have any additional associated cost anymore. And the thing that I'm wondering about is, I mean, it's interesting to see that with the Venezuela thing, a lot of very sovereignty is high on the agenda politicians in Europe are actually not so in love with Trump anymore, or at least they can't publicly say that they are because, well, obviously invading a neighboring country is not respectful of sovereignty. And
Yeah.
so the thing that I'm wondering about is there at some point a political consensus to say, well, actually, this is now number one on the agenda and we're going to go full ahead on it. And there's going to be consequences, but we're already living through most of these consequences anyway.
I think sovereignty is going to be the buzzword of the year for whether it's telecoms or tech generally. I'm probably going to be doing an event in April on that, and there's lots of different touch points, and the question of how sovereign can you be? I mean, maybe French Mistral AI company will build a data center in Greenland or something like that to you, which we might end up debating. But I think that on a more serious note, I think that the definitions of sovereignty will become clearer this year. The moment people throw this term around, and as I've said, there's multiple layers and abstractions to
Yeah.
it. So I think that we're going to, and I also think there's going to be some pragmatism. I think what I do think is that Europe may have overreached with some of its extraterritorial objectives on things like GDPR. And I think that the US is possibly overreaching with its extraterritorial objectives around free speech. Clearly, it's not going to get much traction in China and other places. So we'll see. To me, that seems to be amenable to, hardball diplomacy, in much the same way that defence is. And I don't think that there's going to be anyone pulling the plug on Azure or AWS in Europe, and there's no one going to be pulling the plug on ASML or ARM in the US. And I think that there's going to be some accommodations that will be made. Probably there's going to be an ebb and flow, and we have to deal with whether it's White House or Brussels or Westminster making inflammatory statements occasionally. But I think that's part of the landscape, is you have to deal with occasional blow-ups.
The one thing that I think is maybe worth considering and would have some impact for some of our listeners is that I think there's a very fundamental difference between US based infrastructure services that Europe cannot do without, at least in the short to mid term, and most likely in the long term. And let's call them entertainment services that if they were to be targeted, it might be an outrage from a consumer point of view, but it would really impact nothing. To put it another way, Netflix is very easily substitutable, whereas AWS is not.
Yes.
And so,
And I think ChatGPT is somewhere in the middle. If your kids got their homework projects in ChatGPT, or something like, or your enterprise uses the API, that's looking like infrastructure.
it is, but there are a lot of competitors that you can relatively easily switch to with a bit of relearning, which
Yeah.
is not true. Which is not true of fundamental or physical infrastructure. All I'm saying is I would not be overly surprised if some regulators started looking at this and saying, "Well, I don't have any qualms about targeting certain services anymore because I know there's no systemic impact." Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's fine until Netflix buys, or
Oh,
Paramount buys,
well,
whoever.
well,
Yeah,
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 yeah. No,
yeah,
agreed.
yeah.
But
No, yeah.
that, and I didn't. I mean, the idea was not to target Netflix specifically, but it's more to use an example of what's primarily an entertainment service as opposed to,
Yeah.
and
And
also one that
clearly,
has existing competitors.
well, although interesting there, it becomes very hard to say, oh, we're going to block X without saying we're also going to block TikTok. And so you end up with a bit of a multi-way mutually assured destruction with not just US, but probably China as well.
Yeah. Well, that's a bleak
That's a
note
cheery one. Anyway, but
to
yeah,
start the
I would
year on.
actually one last one on geopolitics is to watch out
Yeah.
for things which are outside of our day to day. And one thing I noticed was there's a diplomatic spat between China and Japan at the moment over various things, particularly Taiwan. But China is putting an export ban on not just things like automotive and rare earth, but some other things like chips and compute and network equipment. And so we might have to also think about the sort of what, as well as the sort of Europe US is what the Europe China dynamic looks like as well, and also
Absolutely.
secondary effects from Japan and South Korea.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great.
All right. Well,
Right, we come.
that was an interesting one. Very,
Yeah.
we ran over a little bit. Hopefully, we didn't lose too many of you, but lots to discuss in 2026 for sure.
Yeah,
Thanks for
and
this, Steed.
thanks, Benoit, and feel free to hit subscribe and reach out to either of us if you'd like to do a deep dive on any of these things.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Bye. See you soon.
Cheers.
Okay,
Cool.
all good.